Hello everyone and welcome to our lecture on the Gunpowder Empires. This lecture we're going to take a look at the three Muslim gunpowder empires, and we'll take a look at a couple others a little bit later that are the non-Muslim ones a little bit later next week. Now before we get started, just make sure you guys understand, and I will say this in the lecture itself, I didn't create this lecture, so there are a couple of slides asking you guys to do something that I'm going to tell you do not have to do. But there are a couple where it's recommended that you could do this just as extra information for yourself. So let's get started. So basically, we're going to talk about the Mughals, the Ottomans, and the Safavids. And realistically, in the last period, we talked about the Mongols and their expansion from East Asia into Central Asia and into Europe and so forth, and Southwest Asia. And by them doing so, it actually changes the Muslim world because of the effects they have on that world itself, and then how the Muslim world actually has effects on them. So the Mughals, the Ottomans, and the Safavids are going to have they're going to have a role in this change. All right, so this kind of gives you an understanding of what we're talking about. So the Ottoman Empire here is in green, the Safavid Empire here is in red, and then the Mughal Empire here is in purple. So we're going to go through and talk about each of these three. All right, so let's talk about some context first to kind of help you guys understand the world at the time. And you need to understand this question: how can we characterize this period in world history? And the reason why you need to understand this question is that this helps you with context. And context is one of the most important skills when you're writing and understanding the greater picture. So always keep this question in mind. Star this question, put it on your notes. How do I characterize this period or this subject or this topic in world history? So basically what's going on is we're in a bridge period between ancient and early modern history at this point. So like you're looking at the Mongols, and then now you're transitioning, and how we're transitioning and talking about how the Islamic world changes with these three empires. So there's an Islamic power shift here during this period from Arab Muslims, so the original source of Islam, to ethnically Turkish Muslims. So in the years prior, in the centuries prior to what we're talking about, you have the Seljuks being brought into the Arab world by the Abbasids, and then they eventually take hold and take power in various parts throughout this region. So you actually have a shift to where you're not actually dealing with Arab Muslims in control, you're dealing with Turkic Muslims that are in control. Now, new technologies such as gunpowder, cannons, and so forth, as well as many others, are going to lead to conquest, and are going to be used for conquest. That's why we call these empires the Gunpowder Empires. And ultimately, what's going to happen throughout this period with these three, we're going to see great cultural, artistic, and architectural developments that are still going to impact not only their rule in their regions that they control, but also the ones that they're going to go on to conquer. All right, so this right here is an example of what we're not going to be taught, what I don't want you guys to do. You do not have to create a new Google slideshow or anything like that. You can if you want to, but you do not have to do that. We're going to be learning about these three going forward. Now, one thing I do recommend, and this is the recommended part, is I would create a Venn diagram in your notes if you choose to do so with the three great rulers for each of these empires. So in the case of the Ottomans, it's going to be Suleiman the Great or Suleiman the Magnificent. With the Safavids, it's going to be Shah Abbas. And then with the Mughals, it's going to be Akbar the Great. So basically what you want to do in this Venn diagram is you want to answer these questions about these three men and see how they overlap. How did they conquer? How did they treat different religions? What were their major accomplishments? Why they declined, or their empires declined? And why are they important today? So not only the cultures themselves, but why do we still study them, and why do we still look at their impact? All right, so let's talk about the Ottoman Empire for a second. This is the Ottoman Empire at its greatest extent. You can see there's different periods of acquisitions and so forth, but basically we could see that they start in Anatolia here, just to the southeast of Istanbul, or excuse me, at the time, Constantinople, and then they're going to spread out over the years around this region and take much of the Balkans, greater part of the Middle East, Egypt, and North Africa. So the Ottoman Empire is the longest lasting and the most successful of these three gunpowder empires. It was founded in 1281 by a man named Osman, who was a Ghazi, a Muslim uh, religious soldier. And this is actually where we're going to get the name Ottoman from. He was a Seljuk Turk, but they're going to develop the name the Ottoman Empire as the Ottomans, followers of Osman. Now, the later rulers within the Ottoman Empire are going to make it so that Muslims are required for military service and that non-Muslims within the empire have to pay the jizya, or the special religious tax, which in some areas, in some periods in Islamic empire or state history, it has been used at a greater extent, in some a lesser extent. But as the empire expands and they need more money, they're mostly going to force this more in a greater impact. It's going to have a greater impact on the non-Muslim cultures. But generally, throughout Ottoman history, the conquered peoples are treated fairly well, and that's one of the reasons why they're going to last such a long time. Now, the conquest of Constantinople is very important for the Ottoman Empire. It's a very important event in world history, being that it actually ends the Byzantine Empire and kind of this transition period, in one of the events that kind of marks why 1450, or the time period around that, is a new period in what we consider here for AP World Modern. But what happens is in 1453, Mehmet II conquers Constantinople after a long a siege. I wouldn't say it's terribly long in the grand scope of things, but it is a siege, and he's going to use gunpowder, specifically cannons, fairly effectively, as well as many other tactics to actually get into the city. If you guys want to check something out, that actually is a really good short, like kind of documentary miniseries on Netflix. It's called The Rise of the Ottomans. It's really good. It deals with this Mehmed's conquest of Constantinople. And then you see here, this is the Hagia Sophia. When they take it over, they're going to transition the Hagia Sophia from a Christian church to an Islamic mosque. And it still stands, obviously, to this day. So the golden age of the the Ottoman Empire is under Suleiman the Magnificent, or Suleiman the Great, and it's primarily because of everything that you see on screen. There's great expansion from a military standpoint. They have a good naval power and are controlling the Mediterranean, as well as the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea for a good portion. But his great military leadership is going to lead to huge amounts of conquest in the Ottoman Empire. So like if you look here, 1520 to 1566, and we go back to the expansion, look at here in terms of what the expansion during his reign, taking Libya, taking most of modern day Iraq, and then expanding here into the rest of the Balkans and pushing into Central Europe. Now, he is stopped at Vienna, and this is kind of that you can link it with like the Battle of Tours, and in these two battles in terms of why Europe doesn't become Islamic, because if they win there, chances are they take the rest of Central Europe and maybe even push up into Eastern Europe and maybe Western Europe. Now, social organization, the Ottoman Empire did very well. During his reign, there was a large bureaucracy that was organized to help rule this expanding and very large empire that was across 3 different continents and covered people of all different faiths and backgrounds. Now, he used janissaries very effectively. If you guys don't remember what janissaries are, they are Christian soldiers that are taken captive from a young age and converted to Islam and taught to owe allegiance directly to the emperor and to follow him. And they're very elite. They're an elite fighting unit. And this is following the Devshirme policy in terms of taking young, typically Christians, but can be others, and kind of teaching them the skills and what are necessary to actually function within society and creating and helping with this bureaucracy or helping with the military. Okay. And then we have the cultural achievements. The Sharia, the Islamic base of law through the Quran, is more organized. and based off of religious tolerance. So you have a legal system that's based in the religion, which is great. There's an efficient taxation system. This goes along with the millets and organization and all that kind of stuff. And then you have the Mosque of Suleiman, which is an important building to show off his power and strength, kind of like what Justinian did with Hagia Sophia. But again, this shows not only the power and strength of the empire, but their cultural advancement. And you can see here is the Mosque of Suleiman. Looks very similar to the Hagia Sophia in a lot of respects. And you see this blending of Turkish artistic styles with the people they conquer. So in the art at the time, if you look at it for the Ottoman period, you see their artistic styles blend with the people they come in contact with. And this is a common theme that you actually see in Islamic culture throughout its history. As they expand, they start to blend with the cultures they come in contact with, specifically in architecture. All right, so now why do they decline? Well, primarily it's because of a process that Suleiman really started to take shape with, or he he started to exile or even murder those next in line, which that kind of, not every ruler after him does this, but a good number do, and it leads to incapable leaders because they're fearful of losing power or having it taken from them from their next in line. And this over time leads to not only poor leadership, but when you add that in, generally oppressive policies so they can maintain control. And then with the expansion that's going on in those oppressive policies, you see greater taxation, and then the peasants ultimately will get upset because nobody likes taxation, and you see rebellions that are going to take place. And eventually this leads to an economic decline because people are going to try to go on the black markets or illegal trade, inflation, and so forth but that's a long-standing process that we won't get into here because we can talk about it as we move forward in history, and there's just a bunch of different things because this empire lasts for so long. Now, ultimately, what's a big change for them is their loss at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, when they're defeated by Spain and Italy and another collection of Christian forces at the Battle of Lepanto. And then ultimately, as we go through history, they're going to dissolve and lose territory to smaller states, and in some cases bigger states, and as the European empires build, such as the Austro-Hungarians or the Italians and so forth, they're going to lose their territory in Europe and on the fringes and become what is known as the sick man of Europe. And then they will ultimately basically dissolve and end and be created into the nation of Turkey with the end of World War I. All right, so now we're going to move on and we're going to talk about our second gunpowder empire, the Safavids. And the Safavids are really, they're in control of what we know as Persia in history, or Iran today is really the majority of the land that they cover. Now, their founder was Saf al-Din. He's Iranian origin. They practice Shiite Islam. Okay, so therefore they believe that the follower or leader should be somebody that's descended from Muhammad. Okay, that's the difference between Shia and Sunni. Now, they were persecuted on religious grounds by the Ottoman Sunni Muslims because of this difference. Now, because of this and because of the animosity that actually develops between, there's an animosity that develops between the Ottomans and the Safavids, and there's various fighting and disputes and stuff over their borders, particularly going back and forth significantly here on their western border or the eastern border of the Ottoman Empire. And you see that they end up, to protect themselves, they build a very powerful army, and the Ottomans do the same. Now, the Ottomans are going to be more focused on, like we talked about, expansion all across the region, but the Safavids are going to build up a very powerful army because of this animosity and these disputes between them and the Ottomans. Now, let's talk about their leadership. Now, Ismail was a very strong leader and a strong warrior for them, and realistically, one of the most important leadership qualities or aspects within the Safavid Empire was Islam. It was their state religion, and you didn't have really any religious freedom under them. So this is something that's a little bit different in terms of where we talked about with the Ottomans, where they were very pretty much religiously tolerant. You see that the Safavids aren't, and it's primarily because, excuse me, of this actions that were being brought about or brought against them by the Ottomans, where they saw that even somebody of their own faith, even though it was a different line of it, were going after them. So they disagreed on religious tolerance. And for one example here, you can see on screen is Ismail is able to have a successful campaign against the Ottomans and take Baghdad. He destroys the city and he kills many Sunnis. And this leads to Sunnis killing Shiites in the Ottoman Empire. But ultimately, what you're going to end up seeing is with this conquest and this victory by the Safavids, by Ismail, it's going to lead to a golden age for that empire. Okay, so the golden age here is actually under the rule of Shah Abbas. So he's the second of the three important or great rulers that we're talking about with these great or gunpowder empires. And he was mostly known for allowing cultural blending to take place. He was much more open to differences and different people, different religions and so forth, even though we just talked about early on the Safavids didn't allow religious tolerance or were kind of against it. Those lines blurred a little bit under Shah Abbas, and you see cultural blending of the Arab worlds, the Ottomans, the Safavids and Persians, and even the Mughals and other groups that are Islamic coming in. Now their capital becomes, which it already was, but it becomes even more so, a cultural, economic, and social educational center is Isfahan or Esfahan. You might see it spelled as or pronounced, but they have good relationships with Europe and China, and primarily you have to think about where they actually sit. They're sitting on a crossroads between areas, between South Asia and Southwest Asia, and there's a link there that they can have with people along those trade routes, whether it's the Silk Road or even a part a little bit into the Indian Ocean realm. Now, one of their greatest resources and aspects of cultural blending are going to be Persian carpets. Persian carpets are actually going to be a blending with Chinese culture and Chinese merchants that come into the Safavid Empire, but then it's going to become our primary export, and we still see this today. Persian carpets are a luxury item and are something that are still sold from this region of the world, and it comes from this period. Now, during this period of Shah Abbas's reign, we're going to see military reforms where you're going to see a mixed army of Persians and Christians that are created. You're going to see development of modern weaponry, most notably with firearms and cannon. And from a government standpoint, he punishes corruption and emphasizes loyalty and skill. And that's an important aspect, because anytime we see in history where you're emphasizing skill with loyalty, generally you see a advancement or better rulership in that empire or state. All right, here's Isfahan. You can see just how ornate it is with the beautiful reflecting pool and so forth out in front of it. You can still visit it, obviously, to this day. All right, so now let's talk about their decline. Well, their decline was their need for power. They wanted to continue to expand, but think about what we're talking about here. You have the Ottoman Empire here to their west, you have the Mughal Empire to their east, and then there's really kind of inhospitable lands here to their north, and they're kind of hemmed in, so they need power and need to expand, but they have two very powerful empires on their sides. And then you add in that after Shah Abbas, they're followed by very incompetent leadership. We see this is a common thread across a lot of cultures in history. When they have a good leader, whether it's just by chance or actions of the leader himself or herself, they're followed by incompetent leadership, or very quickly are. And because of things that are going to take place and actions, you're going to have peasants that are going to start to become discontented because of lack of resources or higher taxes, and ultimately this empire is going to start to break up. Not necessarily all at once, but you might have, for example, here it says tribal armies from Afghanistan start taking over the area, or they start operating within smaller bands within the actual empire itself. Now you have a change in leadership from a religious standpoint. Even though they're Muslim, you actually have a Sunni family that takes control. They're unsuccessful, and they're primarily unsuccessful for a variety of reasons, but really because you have a difference of opinion versus Shia and Sunni Islam. That's still a divide there. But eventually what ends up happening is the Safavids themselves die politically, but not culturally. There's still a strong legacy within Persia that's a cultural link to this group that exists to this day. And so in that sense, they're still around. They're just not around as a political entity anymore. They're there as a cultural entity, and there's a long-lasting legacy there. All right, so now we're going to move on to our third empire. This is the Mughal Empire, and this is my favorite of them in terms of learning about their leaders and what have you. Now, the Mughals, they are, in a sense, descendant from the Mongols. The Mughals, the Mongols, there's a link there. And we won't go any further into the origins, but they're Muslim. The Muslims had been in India since the 700s, so when the Mughals come in and they were Muslim, there's at least a linkage there with that religion. So it's not a complete change. And that was because of the Delhi Sultanate and others that were there. And if you guys remember, the Delhi Sultanate is sitting here to the northern part of India. Now, before we get into the actual Mughal Empire, you need to understand that Tamerlane, who was their descendants and where the Mughals came from, one of the areas people they came from, it was linked to the Mongols, and he actually invades India in 1398. And this is going to ultimately open up the door for the Mughal Empire over a century later. And you're going to have ethnic and religious conflicts that follow in northern India within the Delhi Sultanate after the invasion of Tamerlane, and that is what creates this open door for Babur to come from the north in Central Asia, leave from around the area of Kabul, and defeat Lodi and so forth at the Battle of Panipat, and found the Mughal Empire. Now, the third important ruler here that we need to talk about is Akbar the Great. He's not the first ruler of the Mughals like Babur, but he is perhaps the greatest ruler in this period because of who he is and what he did. You can pretty much think about what's a positive a ruler can do, and Akbar did it. There are a lot of cultural developments. You see the development of a new language, Urdu, which is a collection of Hindi and Persian, and I am actually blanking on the other ones, but it is spoken in a good amount in this area today. There's development of architecture starts to take off, and it's specifically known as Akbar period architecture. You see literary achievements that actually take place in great numbers and expansion there during his rule. You see religious tolerance, and this is perhaps his greatest trait, is because India is this hugely populous area that is primarily Hindu, but you also have still some Buddhists at this time, and then he's the ruling faction that are Muslim, and by promoting religious tolerance, they can actually come together and develop a stronger society in every means, politically, socially, economically, militarily. And you see this, and he makes sure to create a bureaucracy across the empire that mixes everybody, and you see it even across his wives. He marries wives of different faiths, and this tolerance bleeds into taxation. He abolishes the jizya tax, so if you're a non-Muslim, you do not have to pay this special tax, which again is a great thing because people don't like to pay taxes just because they have a different religion than their leaders, or really they don't like to pay taxes at all. They did come up with a tax system, though, that was a graduated income tax that was based on so many different factors and was fair across the board, or at least fairly, it was fairly fair across it. Now, in terms of the conquest of India, Akbar is going to he's not going to rule over the Mughal Empire at its greatest extent, but they're going to expand greatly. He's going to use gunpowder to great effectiveness, both in firearms and cannon. He's going to use elephants very effectively in his armies, and he's going to use Rajput officers from the Rajput kingdoms of northern India. He's going to take them over, and then because of tolerance, he's going to use them to effectively help lead his armies, which is a good skill. All right, so what you're seeing on the screen right now is the Mughal expansion under Akbar, and then the subsequent rulers after him, Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb. So, like I said on the last slide, Akbar is going to expand the empire greatly, but it's not going to be at its greatest extent. That'll actually come under Aurangzeb. But you can see he's ruling a large area, spreading into Central Asia and the northern part of South Asia. So that's a really big area. It covers millions and millions of people and of different faiths and ethnicities. And that's an important aspect of understanding really how great Akbar is because just looking at the map, and then when you have a basic understanding of, these traits, then you can see just how effective a ruler he is, at least in a basic sense. All right, so let's move on. So after Akbar, well, you have Jahangir and Nur Jahan. They are decent rulers, but they're less religious. There's less of a religious tolerance that they have of the different peoples of the empire. And this causes problems, primarily between the Mughals and the Sikhs of northern India. Now, Shah Jahan, who takes over shortly after the rule of Jahangir and Nur Jahan, is somebody that hated political competition. And this is where you can make a comparison with what was going on with the leadership of the Ottoman Empire after Suleiman the Great, is their rulers started to hate political competition, and it started to kind of rot away the infrastructure of the empire. And one of the biggest things that actually hurt the Mughal Empire here and is going to continue under the rulership of Aurangzeb is the high number of taxes because of military conquests and campaigns, but also because of ornate palaces and programs that the Shah wanted. And in particular, it's the Taj Mahal. So he builds the Taj Mahal. It's perhaps the greatest building, most beautiful building ever built, for a memento to his dead wife Mumtaz, but it is a lot of taxes, and the working conditions are terrible, and the lower classes are feeling subjugated because of these bad conditions and high taxes. And just so happens that there's a huge drought during this period, so there's some political instability. Now, when Shah Jahan is overthrown and his son Aurangzeb is able to take control, Aurangzeb is going to be a very successful leader and empire builder for the Mughals. As a matter of fact, he's going to control the empire at its greatest size. However, you have all of these negatives that have kind of started to seep in to the empire that we've talked about here a little bit previously, but then you add in the fact that he's very oppressive and he wants to take control or keep that control, so that causes problems. And then he starts to bring back the jizya tax that Akbar had gotten rid of, so he starts to enforce those Islamic laws and things against his people. Primarily the Hindus are going to be the people that get outraged, and they're the majority of the population, and this is going to lead to regional factional groups that are going to go against the Mughals, and most notably the Maratha Confederacy to the south, which are mentioned here, at least on the map in a sense, are going to develop a state and start to push back against him. And then also at the same time, you have to understand too, this is when the Europeans themselves, such as the Dutch and the British, are starting to gain a greater foothold in this region, and that's going to change the scope and history of this region as well. All right, so the decline of the Mughal Empire, it's the Rajputs, it's the Hindu warrior leaders that really push back. They rebel. You have the wars for conquest. They cost a lot of money. There's taxes. And like I mentioned, famine hits around at this period. And there's no specific loyalty to the leader, either Shah Jahan or Aurangzeb in this period. And because of this, you have a weakened central state over a wide-ranging area geographically, but also socially, politically, religiously, and just from a populist standpoint, and power shifts to the local lords. So this is kind of the idea when we think about, we talked about in units 1 and 2, we talked about India. There wasn't full control over this region, this subcontinent, and it was primarily left to these decentralized local states like the Rajput kingdoms that we talked about previously. And this starts to happen again, and India basically devolves into this patchwork of independent states, and bingo, trade with the Europeans comes in at the right time, and India is conquered by the Europeans, and ultimately the British will win that, and they will be the ones to firstly basically keep this entire, or organize, control this entire subcontinent. All right, so last slide here, there's some connections and predictions that you guys need to make, and you need to keep these things in mind. Number one, what similarities do you notice so far between these three gunpowder empires? And then you're also going to keep that in mind when we look at the other land-based or gunpowder empires of Unit 3. And then number two, what seems to be the most important effects of the conquests of these gunpowder empires? So what's the most important things that happen when they actually take over or expand? What did they do? And again, as always with these three groups of people, look back to that comparison or that Venn diagram that's a recommended activity with those three leaders. What made them great, or why did people call them great or effective rulers? Because that can help you with that question. All right, guys, thanks for listening. I'll see you.